We had agreed to, as I've shared before in the press, really the best deal available to any country on the planet with respect to Canada.
Who really killed the deal?
And then, the Minister LeBlanc went back to Ottawa, and they spoke with premiers, spoke with the Prime Minister, and when they came back, they had some additional views, they had some additional requests, they had some additional things that were too much for the United States. The reality is we have a trade policy. It's global in nature. We're proceeding with it. If there's further retaliation from the Canadian side, we of course we're not going to just sit down and take that.
In a U.S. interview, President Donald Trump said that Canada is taking advantage of the U.S. as though they were a state. Asked about these comments today, Industry Minister Melanie Joly said Canada takes note of what the president says, but has a message of its own.
We are in a position of strength, and in these circumstances, we'll continue to fight because Canada is worth fighting for.
That is the American story. Here is Ottawa's.
So, Mr. Charest, the Prime Minister said trade talks fell apart because of last-minute changes by the Trump administration. Now the President is conceding that he and his team did pull something like that. Trump spoke to CNN's Jim Sciutto yesterday. Let's read some of what he said. He said, "That sounds to me like the President," responding to Sciutto's question about whether Canadian officials were right when they said that there were some late-stage U.S. demands. Sciutto pressed him, "So you don't deny it?" And the President replied, No, I don't deny anything."
Well, it certainly does vindicate. And on the other hand, JP, when you reach an agreement in principle, and I've been in a lot of negotiations, then you get to the last leg of it. It's always a little complicated because issues come up. People want to raise things and they want to make the text more perfectible. That's normal. But then you reach a point where it's not changing the text or making it perfectible. It's actually new issues. And that's where Canada decided to sign off. Also, JP, other players got involved. It was Jamieson Greer's show until we got in the last stretch, and then other members of the administration show up. And the thing falls apart.
Yeah, and despite the president conceding that, there were some last-minute changes, Howard Lechnick perhaps being involved, although the president didn't address that directly, the White House has now issued a statement essentially blaming Canada for the failed negotiations. They said instead of partnership, Canada chose unreasonable demands, walkbacks, and flat-out rejection. Does it seem to you like the administration is trying to cast Canada as the villain in this movie?
Well, yes, I think the administration is clearly trying to lay blame at our door. And then, they have a pretty big grip on the American media market, so they can do that.
I think you're right. And I think the sort of closer, the Canadians are going to have a story and the Americans are going to have a story. The truth is somewhere in between. I'm more inclined to trust Canadian negotiators, but I also think it's very common in trade negotiations to come to versions of an agreement, have to go away, look into some details, come back, seek clarification, press on other items. It's obviously a common negotiating tactic of President Trump to throw a spanner in the works at the last minute. I don't think we should be all that surprised by that, but it seems like something that he would do. So I'm not sure I take the trade rep, all due respect to him, at face value. The New York Times had some really great reporting a few days ago that I think presented a really plausible, balanced account of Canadians seeking some clarification and maybe even some changes near the end of the negotiations, and the Americans doing so as well. The Canadians decided what their red lines were. The Americans did as well, and drive their point. And that's what you're seeing from the Americans as well.
So which story is true? A CBC panel put both against the reporting.
Jordan, you can go wherever you want with this, but I'll just point out that reading between the lines, you don't really have to read that closely. It seems like they are intent on destroying the auto industry in this country, though, right? I mean, he said...
Well, you don't even have to read between the lines.
Yeah, I mean, he explicitly says, we believe the process of globalization for the United States of integrating even closer to our neighbors has had negative effects. And he says, this is not the auto pact, this is not NAFTA, this is not USMCA even. They don't want manufacturing employment as it relates to autos in this country. That is their intent. And that's why there were those changes at the last minute, if we're to believe the Canadian narrative about heavy-duty trucks, medium-duty trucks. That would have shut down Ford in Oakville, right? They're re-gearing to make the F-250 in this country. Of course, the Chevy Silverado is already made at the Oshawa plant for General Motors. Those would be wiped off the map with these tariff rates that they set. I think to me that was maybe the newsiest thing from this interview, only because we knew that's what they wanted to do, but he's saying it pretty clearly now that they're intent on destroying an industry that's hugely significant to Ontario.
But here's what nobody noticed in the blame game, buried in Greer's own interview. The part about your job
is that you can't also trust the agreement, any agreement that Trump is going to sign. One of the other details that's been reported out is that the U.S. was even seeking to bake into the agreement clauses that would allow them to apply tariffs notwithstanding what
reported, not confirmed. But it echoes what Ottawa keeps saying, American agreements written in pencil.
Everyone's very clear about that. It hurts us too. It's not without its own cost.
Yeah, well, let me ask you about that because, of course, Canada is hitting back with retaliatory tariffs. They announced yesterday new levies on nearly $30 billion worth of American goods that are coming into this country. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has a statement out about this. He's raising concerns about this plan along the lines of what you just said. And he's saying that the government's new levies are, quote, akin to tax on our families for the privilege of appearing tough. What do you say to Mr. Poilievre? Do you think that he's right that this plan to go dollar for dollar with Trump and his tariffs is a potentially risky proposition?
Well, standing up for ourselves, standing up for the sovereignty of Canada is not a privilege. It is a responsibility of the government of Canada and of each and every one of us. And everyone is very aware, JP, that when we do counter tariffs, it's the best choice out of bad choices. We know that. Everyone, I think, has been very transparent about that. But we do reach a point in the relationship, as is the case now, where you have to respond. And you have to stand up for yourself, because if you don't, they'll just run right over you. And in the case of the United States, it has to be made very clear that there are red lines that we're just not going to cross. And we are not a vassal state. And we are going to defend our economy.
To put this in context, Canada is our second largest trading partner. We're doing about $900 billion a year in trade with Canada, and that's about double what we do with China, just to give some context to that. And the interesting thing is that the balance of that between imports and exports is about 50-50. So in other words, we import as much from Canada as we export to them. And so, as Scott said, because of the nature of that relationship, when Canada imposes retaliatory tariffs, they have the capacity to do quite a bit of damage to American exporters. So, as Scott said, we're not at that phase of the proceeding right now, but we could easily get there given the rhetoric on both sides here. And that's going to be very bad, not only for American consumers who are going to be paying higher prices for things we import from Canada, including energy, to wine, to hockey sticks, but be very bad for American exporters, especially in the upper Midwest. You know, we export a lot of auto parts and autos to China. We export a lot of machinery to Canada, and all of that is going to hurt our manufacturing base. So the irony of these tariffs, which are being pursued in theory to help our manufacturers, is that this retaliatory process is actually going to end.
Now cross the border. This is not Canadian television. This is an American panel on an American network.
And all these, even if we're I'm in a very red state, GP, very red state, and the bourbon industry and their liquor is off the shelves. They're not hostile to Canada. Again, they look at the bigger picture. They say, okay, this doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. The tariffs don't make sense. Deal with it. The challenge for us has always been to mobilize the business community in the United States and business leaders to be more vocal. And that's a problem. It's a challenge because it's Donald Trump. But this is a new episode. And I think we're going to see a little bit more, a lot.
And remember where Charest was speaking from. Louisville, Kentucky. Bourbon country, a very red state. So, who killed the deal? Here's what the record shows. A deal in principle on Tuesday. Late additions on the table. Trucks, language, and an alignment demand Ottawa read as sovereignty. A White House statement blaming Canada. And a president who, asked directly, said, No, I don't deny anything. Both sides wanted changes. One side walked when the changes touched who gets to run Canada's economy. That is the record. You can judge it.